Okay, so we got some clarifications to do on existing coverage because new information has come to light. And where should we start on this one, Oliver? I think we should start on some work Tom has done based on feedback for Street Fighter 6 Switch, where prior to this, we only had very, very limited assets to look at from that Nintendo Direct. And basically, we said native 1080p. It's not native 1080p, but investigating how it's upscaling has produced some interesting results, right?
So basically, as far as I understand it, Tom originally pixel counted Street Fighter 6 as having a 1080p resolution on Switch 2, which it turns out was just the output resolution for 3D content, because it does seem to count internally to 540p there. And indeed, when you actually look at those pixel edges, there is a certain characteristic that is indicative of DLSS among temporal solutions, which is that it has those curved edges. When you reveal an edge, it is a curved edge. And so we think that that is actually a title, interestingly enough, that's using DLSS. We believe that it may be using DLSS to upscale to 1080p, which is certainly intriguing to me because that's a 60 FPS title. We, as of yet, have not seen that, and this does appear to be that case. Now, interestingly, obviously, on the surface, that might not sound very positive, right? Because initially we pegged it as a 1080p 60 title. It's only a 540p 60 title, right? That's DLSS in performance mode, it looks like. But actually, when you compare it to Series S footage, that title on Series S has much more questionable image quality. Now, of course, with RE Engine, you do not have a great suite of temporal anti-aliasing techniques necessarily to pick from. It's not a great situation. But yeah, I mean, the Switch 2 version, even though it's 540p internal, it looks crisper, looks sharper, looks cleaner even in motion, looks quite nice there. And I think that was Tom's impression. That was certainly my impression from reviewing his footage. It does actually look better than Series S in some respects. Now, it's missing some key rendering features from Series S, most notably perhaps screen space reflections. Those are not present. I think some other bits of environmental detail. So yeah, that is certainly a correction there. But I actually think in this case, the correction is actually a fairly positive correction in terms of this game's overall appearance. Yeah, I think it's good.
Mm-hmm. Also, getting rid of SSR, I would argue, is a very positive thing in any RE Engine game.
RE Engine.
It's extremely distracting and ugly looking in every other version of the game. So that's a win for the Switch. I think the main thing it's missing is the muscle deformation system that was in the quote-unquote next-gen version at the time. So it's not quite there, but everything else about it, looking at this video, I definitely agree. It looks a lot sharper and nicer on Switch 2 versus the Series S version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, obviously, that Capcom decided to make that decision. And 540p is a very low internal resolution. But at the same time, you have to wonder what the computational cost of DLSS is there, which is possibly moving that resolution down. Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit, Tom's comparisons here of the Series S version versus the Switch 2 is actually really quite revelatory. It does look as though there are high quality textures on the Switch 2, which you'd kind of expect as it has more memory. But at the same time, it seems to be definitely having an impact there. And it's really sort of testament to why DLSS is a good thing to have. I mean, I guess there'll be a certain degree of sharpening in there as well, which possibly would have helped the Series S version. but even so, yeah, interesting stuff.
It's great. I think this is great news in general for Switch, by the way, because I think we're going to see some lower resolution titles, and the original Switch just didn't have a way to deal with that, right?
Right.
And now we're going to be able to get that increased fidelity of the more powerful hardware. But even if you're targeting these low resolutions, DLSS can help bring that image quality up to a place that looks probably very acceptable to even great.
Right. And the other thing, of course, is at the hands-on event, we didn't get to see the game running on handheld. So you kind of have to wonder what the solution is that they're deploying for the handheld version of the game.
Right.
If base resolution docked with the much higher GPU clock is going to be 540p, what are they doing on handheld? That was something from the hands-on experience that I still don't feel I've got a particular handle on. The gulf between handheld and docked. I still think that's a bit of a question mark. But yeah, that's Street Fighter 6 looking good. But we got to talk about Metroid Prime 4 as well, Oliver, because this is an interesting situation where we made a determination of native 4K resolution, but it was based on the direct aftermath of the Nintendo Direct, where the assets that we had access to were limited. Subsequent to that, better quality assets have appeared. And I think it's thanks to Lurig, is that the guy's name on the Discord? Who did the heavy lifting on the pixel counting there on that higher quality assets, that we've got a better fix on that now.
Yeah, so for Metroid Prime 4, I think the game looks, like subjectively speaking, it's important to mention, like it does look quite crisp and even 4K-like in some respects. Like it's sharp, it's clean, it has some anti-aliasing treatment there, it appears as well. Unlike the other versions of Prime 4, which are very raw. So the Switch 2 version at 1080p 120 is a raw, no anti-aliasing image. Likewise, for the game, it appears at 1080p, or rather at 900p 60 on Switch 1 in docked mode. It also appears to run without any anti-aliasing treatment. It looks very much like a 900p title. And this also has a 4K UI. So in my early impressions, I pegged it as a 4K image, but on further reflection and after some better pixel counts of the higher quality asset, it appears to be 1440p internally. Again, with some kind of reasonably effective anti-aliasing, with some upscaling to 4K. And about that upscaling, I'm not 100% sure what's going on. Now, if you scale the image that's provided here to 1440p, it loses a lot of detail. It kind of looks like FSR1-ish, but with FSR1, usually raw edges are curved and rounded off more than we're seeing here. And it also doesn't have a super painterly look. So I'm questioning that, but at the same time, I don't think they're using TAA. Based off of image breakup over time, it does not look like a TAA to me. So again, but part of the problem here is we only have about half a minute of high quality footage. And even with Nintendo's press assets, they aren't ideal. With someone like Sony, when we get press assets from Sony, they're these gigantic ProRes files that are many, many gigabytes. With Nintendo, their press assets actually aren't that high quality. We have a few hundred megabyte Metroid Prime file here, which is not ideal. And in general, their media production is not, I mean, this is a tangent, but their media production stuff is not as good as Microsoft's or Sony's. Like, when you look, they did a Hogwarts Legacy feature recently, and they had kind of like this mediocre video quality with lots of artifacts, and they had like stabilization in post, so they clearly filmed it handheld and then used like their warp stabilizer in Premiere or something to stabilize it. That didn't look very good. So I'll on this particular game, I'm going to refrain from offering too many opinions on its image quality from this point onwards before we have the final code. But I think once we have the final code, we can probably work out what it's doing much more easily. But I think, like, subjectively speaking, I still think it's like very crisp, sharp, good looking, just not native 4K.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, because obviously we're going from 900p 60 upwards from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. Zelda, we had 900p 30 going to 1440p 60, but I guess that's just, you know, different games have different requirements really in terms of how far they can be pushed. Interesting.
Yeah.
But you're quite right. We did have quite a lot of material for other titles, you know, what with the Treehouse stuff that appeared in the aftermath, which is something we don't have so much for with Metroid Prime.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up, Rich. It's interesting you bring that up because over the past few hours, I've decided to go back into our archives and pixel count the last two titles that I think we had some curiosity about, which was Pokemon Legends Z to A and Kirby and the Forgotten Land. And those were games that were much easier to pixel count than Metroid Prime, thankfully, for my purposes. So Pokemon Legends Z to A, I think you're seeing evidence actually in this title of some of the more conservative scaling that you're talking about there, because Pokemon Legends Z to A looks like it's running at about 1080p 60. And it does look pretty soft in the footage that we do have. But interestingly, the edges clean up a lot over time after being exposed. So I actually suspect they're probably using a TAA here, which is not too crazy, but the Switch 1 version, you know, it was 720p 30 with no anti-aliasing treatment. It looked like a pretty raw image, or very minimal anti-aliasing treatment if there was any at all. So I think the Pokemon fans will be pleased with that, but that is more conservative scaling, you know, 720p 30 to 1080p 60. Not quite as compelling as the Zelda scaling, I would say. But I would say one possible silver lining there is that at 1440p or 4K resolution or something with Pokemon, I think those flat building facades would look even worse. So I think that it might actually be okay that it's a little bit softer. I think that might actually be okay.
I think the solution to that would have been something like a nice depth of field effect for the distance in that game.
Could be, absolutely. That would have been awesome. I think that would look better. There's also Kirby and the Forgotten Land, which was a dynamic 1080p on Switch 1 docked, dynamic 1080p 30, going back to John's coverage, going down to, I think you counted a low of about 810p.
Yeah,
looking
something
at coverage
like that.
now. And this is even more interesting in terms of the scaling, because I was counting it out at 1080p 60 in the shots that we have, around 1080p 60. So that looks like there's some post-A in the mix, maybe some FSR1 for upscaling as well, possibly in the mix there. It does look more FSR1 to me than Metroid does, but that's a little bit more conservative. So I agree, Rich, 900p 60 to 1440p 60 relative to like a dynamic 900p 30 to 1440p 60. Obviously, there's a bit of a divergence there, but there's an even bigger difference between these two titles and what you might expect, right? Because they're not scaling up a whole lot, going from going to 1080p 60 from their original pixel counts and frame rate metrics there. Not too amazing. So hopefully, I would hope that we see games fall more in line with that Zelda upgrade, because I think that Zelda upgrade going to 1440p 60 from 900p 30 was pretty satisfying, even if it wasn't quite the 4K 60 that we were promised from the Gamescom demos. Those always seemed a little bit questionable to me. I always thought maybe it was 1440p 60 and people in the room were just dazzled by it, right? Because you can never really tell that, if most people could not really tell the difference too much. But yeah, just a few notes there on some other titles that we did not originally comment on, but I do have some firmer counts on them. And the scaling there is not 100% what I was hoping for necessarily, but still probably satisfactory.
Yeah, a couple of notes for me. I mean, obviously they're being marketed as 4K. I think that's should have an asterisk attached. That's sort of slightly questionable.
Hey, it's their first time doing 4K.
Right. Okay. I think the other point is that I don't particularly mind. I think there's a kind of divide between Switch and the other consoles, because we are dealing with fundamentally different beasts. All I really want for Switch 2 is a system where I don't mind docking it and playing it on a huge screen. It should present reasonably on that big screen, right? I think going back to that Street Fighter footage against the Series S version, that's kind of mission accomplished, right? It's got a low internal resolution, but I can watch that comparison video playing out on my 4K screen directly in front of me here, and it still looks reasonable, right? It's just that was the issue with Switch 1, where I felt compelled to play in handheld, even if there was occasionally a performance penalty, simply because I just couldn't really stand a lot of the games as they played on a big living room display. I don't know what you think about that, John, as a owner of a similarly vast flat panel.
I remain concerned. I was thinking, so I have this whole thing where I use a scaler on the Switch to get that like 1080p to 4K nearest neighbor scaling.
Oh, nice.
And I was thinking, yes, with the Switch 2, I don't need to do that anymore. We're all good. Now I'm starting to rethink that, because it doesn't really feel like we're going to be getting that much of a 4K experience. And it's also making me think that they messed up by targeting a 1080p internal screen as well.
Right. Okay.
I mean, look, when you play on the Steam Deck now, do you ever look at that and say, man, I wish that screen was way higher resolution?
No.
I don't think so. It looks freaking awesome at that size. And it would allow more games to hit native resolution if it were a 720p screen again. And instead, well, I feel like we're going to have like almost everything upscaled to that screen. So you're talking about Kirby, and one of the things that made that look so good on the original Switch is that you get that native 720p output on the handheld screen, so it was super crisp. And if handheld mode has to drop below 1080p now on the Switch 2, it could arguably end up looking worse, because now you're dealing with LCD upscale blur, which is not optimal. So I don't know. I'm a little bit concerned about this side of things, the amount of scaling and the low resolution targets we're seeing.
Yeah, I actually think just flat out I would trade the Switch 2 screen for the Steam Deck OLED screen. Like
absolutely
any day, because even I actually think 720p or 800p or something in that range, I think that's an improvement. I think the HDR is much better. I think that obviously it being an OLED is much preferable. Losing VRR kind of sucks, but even still, I would take that screen. I think there was some question about exactly how effective is DLSS going to be in both the handheld and in dock modes. And I think what we've seen so far after some revisions here in terms of DLSS in obviously Street Fighter and in Cyberpunk is that it's very usable. It's workable. People can use it for, let's say, a 1080p upscale. That is pretty reasonable. but it's not going to get you to 1080p in handheld mode, probably in most titles. They are trying it in Cyberpunk. I'm curious to see how well that works out. It's not going to get you to 4K, certainly in the docked mode. It's more appropriate for 1080p there, maybe 1440p at a stretch, although we'll have to see how that works out in actual games that might upscale to a resolution like that. So yeah, given that circumstance, I really wish that the internal screen had been 720p.